Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode on Muslims of the Melting Pot. Today we have yet another special guest. Miko Peled is an author, writer, and human rights activist who was born and raised in the city of Jerusalem. He is now one of the clearest voices calling for justice in Palestine and is the author of the book The General's Son: Journey of an Israeli in Palestine.
Total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Because it's the only religion that acts like the mafia.
They're not immigrants. They're invaders. They're not immigrants.
This clash of civilizations.
And if they're not going to learn to assimilate, I don't want them in this country.
But hold up, that's not really who we are. Perhaps the American melting pot model is not an accurate depiction of the true Muslim American experience. And perhaps the goal is not to mix. But if it isn't, then what really is? To assimilate or not to assimilate? That's the question. I'm your host, Sara Salimi, and you are watching Muslims of the Melting Pot. Thank you, Miko, so much for being another guest on my podcast. I'm very, very excited for this conversation. One thing that I really try to focus on with this podcast is you said something in one of the speeches that I saw from you, and that was how you said the truth lies in the personal story and not necessarily in the national narrative. And I think that really comes at the heart of this conversation because I rarely hear those personal stories as, a testament to what's really happening, because the national narrative is that, Israelis had this right of return, that the Arabs attacked and that the Israelis won, and, how the Arabs are the ones who didn't accept the partition plan. The Arabs, are always the aggressors. Your personal story, though, I would say as the son of an Israeli general, is very different. You've seen all of this firsthand. You've been there. Your family was quite literally, they saw a lot of these things unfolding in front of them. So I want to start from here. Tell us how this experience was for you growing up. What did you see? What did you learn?
Well, thanks for having me on your show. He was part of this generation of giants, of Zionist giants, who were young officers in 1948 and who defeated these massive Arab armies that came to destroy the small Jewish state. And then he was a general in 1967, when once again the Arabs, according to the narrative, of course, tried to come and destroy the small Jewish state. And then there was this massive victory. And so he was a member of the Israeli main command, high command, planning this attack in 1967. And like I said, of course, he participated in the ethnic cleansing in 1948 and so on. So, I grew up eating this whole narrative up. It was wonderful. I mean, my dad was a hero. Are you kidding me?
Right.
I had a great uncle who was a president, and I had all these really important people in my family who were part of this great creation, the state of Israel. So I grew up very proud of all of that.
Right.
And then when my dad when my dad became interested in Palestinian rights, I mean, it happened gradually. But after the '67 war, that's when he came out and said, we need a Palestinian state, we need to make peace with the Palestinians. It came from a very Zionist perspective, a very patriotic Zionist perspective, because he wanted to maintain the spoils of 1948, and he said, this is how we do it, by compromising on 1967. But of course, nobody cared. Nobody wanted to do even that. So he became an outcast. So that was his trajectory, and that was his life.
I know we usually hear about the fathers most since they're kind of seen as the forefront of it all. But I was also very intrigued by the stories you mentioned about your mother, where you said she refused to settle into a Palestinian home that the Israelis had offered to her. And this was, you were saying when they had forced the Palestinians out of their homes in 1948. What was that scene like in person? Did you see this, or was this something she narrated?
No, I was born till 20 some odd years later. No, she was
okay.
My older sibling, my older siblings were born. This is 1948, West Jerusalem, which a lot of people don't realize. There was an absolute 100% ethnic cleansing campaign that did not allow a single Palestinian to remain in West Jerusalem.
Right.
And there were many neighborhoods, Palestinian neighborhoods, quite wealthy, well-to-do neighborhoods in West Jerusalem. Their homes are still there. Most of the neighborhoods are still there. And she was 22 years old, already a mother, living in a tiny apartment, sharing an apartment with her mother. And these homes were all one of these beautiful homes. And at 22, she had the moral courage to say, how can I take the house of another mother? How can I move into the home of a family that are now refugees? And She refused. And, at 22, when you're living under some pretty difficult conditions, to refuse something like that. I mean, she did the right thing, obviously. And what's unfortunate is that it was an environment where doing the right thing was unique. They're called Arab homes, but nobody ever asked where did the Arabs go?
What happens?
Again, the ethnic cleansing of West Jerusalem was so complete that the only thing that remains are the homes.
Exactly.
And inevitably, when I tell the story at a lecture, there's always an older Palestinian man or woman who come to me in tears because were from there. They had a home in West Jerusalem in one of these wonderful neighborhoods, and they're like in awe that my mother made this right choice. But I think the fact that we even talk about it, that it's unique that she made this choice, is indicative of how serious the problem was.
Do you recall how it was like growing up in Jerusalem? How the relationship was, if any, interaction between Israelis and Palestinians? How was it like for you growing up there?
No, there was no interaction at all. It's the most segregated city in the world.
Right.
You know, I was a young boy in 1967 when Israel occupied East Jerusalem, and you know, it would be a novelty to go to the old city, you know, walk around, but only around with a bunch of Israelis. You never walk alone. It's dangerous. There was nothing. There was not a single interaction. You know, we go to different schools. We speak different languages. We, you know, in the neighborhoods, the residential neighborhoods in East Jerusalem look nothing like our neighborhoods. I mean, there are no sidewalks. Forget
Right.
playgrounds, forget grass, forget, you know, spaces for kids to run around or for people to, there's none of that. And Israel wouldn't allow it. The municipality of Jerusalem would not allow Palestinians to develop anything like that.
I remember this was interesting. You had said this, that the first time you actually sat down to talk to a Palestinian was when you had come back to the U.S. How effective, or what role do you think it played that there was such a strict segregation between the Israelis and Palestinians, specifically painting the Palestinians as the aggressors? What role do you think that plays or continues to play in the way that Palestinians are seen?
Well, it's the only way to maintain an apartheid regime is by always characterizing the other as dangerous and dishonest and dirty and lazy and on and on and on. I mean, what you know, colonialist regimes do everywhere. The only reason it's that way is because of segregation, because Israel wants it to be that way. They don't want Israelis and Palestinians to get together. And today, you know, of course, you know, East Jerusalem is filled with settlements, both the old city itself, but also all these
Right.
neighborhoods that were taken, lands that were taken from Palestinians, and massive, you know, neighborhoods were built.
Why was it ethnic cleansing that you would say was, you know, the tactic that was taken forward? Because these people had experienced the Holocaust. They knew what it was like to live under conditions where you're exterminated and wiped out. Why do you think that that was done to the Palestinians?
It's interesting for many reasons, but one reason is that the term or the designation of a crime as a crime against humanity was created after the Holocaust, after the genocide of the Jews by the Nazis. The world realized that there are crimes that are so heinous that they're considered crimes against humanity. And 3 years after the Holocaust, after the genocide of the Jews, a state that calls itself the Jewish state, and at that point there were no Holocaust, very few Holocaust survivors went there. So the Zionists who were in Palestine had nothing to do with the Holocaust. These were not survivors of the Holocaust. They began committing not one, but 3 crimes that are considered crimes against humanity. The ethnic cleansing that you mentioned, which was was a planned ethnic cleansing. It was a planned campaign to kick out the Palestinians from Palestine. Palestine was very successful. They managed to kick out almost 1 million people. Almost 1 million people were thrown out of their land, out of their country, out of their homes, many of them having to, dying along the way. There were massacres that are still being uncovered today. I mean, we know of some of the massacres that are well known, but there are massacres that people don't even know that are being uncovered today as we speak. The ethnic cleansing was part of this campaign of genocide to get rid of the Arabs of Palestine, or what the way the Zionists call them, the Arabs of Israel. And then what they did was they installed a state that was in fact an apartheid regime, because it gave rights to people like me at the expense of people like you, at the expense of Palestinians, very, very simply, And that regime has been going on for 75 years. In other words, it was never planned to be a democracy. It was never planned to be pluralistic. It was always intended to be a supremacist apartheid state. And that's exactly the way the Amnesty report, described it in their report last year.
You mentioned how if you were to look at, the scene of how Palestine at that point looks, there's almost nothing left for the Palestinians. So now you're looking at a point in time where they want to do peace talks after it's almost like saying, the deed has already been done and now we want to come to the negotiating table. Over 2 decades have passed and now we're at a point where it's like, what does negotiating do? What's there even left to be talking about?
Nothing. There's nothing to talk about, and I don't believe that Israel is a partner for peace anyway. Israel doesn't want peace. Israel wanted to create a small entity, which is the Palestinian Authority, that would follow their rules and collect the trash and do what they're told, and that's exactly what this is.
It's always framed in a way where, oh, it's the Palestinians who don't want to cooperate. It's the Palestinians who don't want to make concessions. But, from what you're saying, it doesn't seem like that's really the case. Why do you think that there is such an insistence then?
Well, the only way, what Israel does, Israel is they've got a very smart strategy. And they always have, by the way, before Israel was established, the Zionists, this is how they operated. They had their kind of the outwardly face. They had all these well-polished diplomats that were traveling around the world. My grandfather was one of them in the 20s and 30s, traveling around the world, speaking to Jewish communities, trying to convince them to immigrate to Palestine, speaking to leaders around the world, trying to explain to them why Zionism is a good idea. And these have always been very polished people, highly educated. They're all doctors, and they had, degrees, and they shaved. They didn't look like Jews, and so the Europeans liked them, and they could relate to them. And so in the early days, you had these characters like my grandfather, like Golda Meir, they made this movie about her, like she's some kind of a hero. These are all people who are perpetuating the idea of a genocide and apartheid state. Today is no different. Netanyahu and a few other ambassadors who speak English well and look very polished are out there spewing this nonsense, these lies. American politicians are lining up to kiss Netanyahu's hand, while the Israeli Knesset is passing legislation, racist law after racist law after racist law. I mean, at a record speed, and the murder of Palestinians goes on wholesale. And the crimes against Palestinians, the torture, the arrest of children, the detention, go on and on and on, denying people water, home demolitions by the tens of thousands. And I'm talking about 1948 Palestine. I'm not just talking about the West Bank.
Right.
Denying Palestinians water, electricity, and home demolitions, and denying them rights, education, and to jobs, and on and on and on.
You mentioned Netanyahu, and I believe this was the interview he was having with Peterson, and this is something that I hear a lot from the Zionist perspective of, when it's not even just, that the Arabs were the aggressors. They're very intent in saying that when we came to that land, there were no Arabs. It was like deserted land, kind of like a place left in shambles. There's a lot of these things that are said, and when you look at it from a historical perspective, they're complete lies. It's like there's no truth to them, and it's surprising that people actually buy this stuff. From what the West likes to call Israel as like the biggest democracy in the Middle East. It's quite laughable that such things are so easily accepted when history really paints a very different picture.
Yes, and there's a lot of documentation. I mean, you have to be real ignorant not to realize that Palestine was a thriving, populous country. With a strong economy, with a political life, with a very strong culture. Very diverse, very tolerant, going back as far as history can record. Entire cities were taken. How much does that cost? What do you get for that? Entire cities. Haifa, Ramle, Lid, Jaffa, Jerusalem. On and on and on. Entire cities, buildings, roads, agricultural, produce on the fields. People had money in the banks. Money was stolen. Automobiles, you name it. They stole everything. The land was cultivated. Jaffa oranges, where do they come from? They're exporting
the olive trees,
and oil.
There's a lot, yeah.
They're exporting citrus. Palestine was a thriving economy, and what's interesting is that they were exporting to the rest of the world as Palestine. And every map and every document under the sun called the country Palestine until May 15, 1948. The world forgot. And this long, rich history and culture suddenly disappeared from people's memory, and everybody decided to call it Israel.
The social amnesia, the political amnesia is real because, as you said, these people knew exactly what the case was, and it's almost like the whole history was erased and rewritten in a very different narrative, with the kind of winners and the heroes of the situation being painted as, the ones who are after the freedom and the peace and the democracy, whereas those who were actually living there were completely forgotten. The Palestinians, in some ways, are the forgotten people. Because, as you're saying, a lot of these things that you're saying would be considered and are considered international war crimes. They are things that would never be accepted if they were done to any other population, especially those that, have the luxury of being backed by Western nations and the power and the wealth. One thing that I was curious about I know your father became a very fierce defender of Palestinian rights. You yourself, I believe you have also mentioned you've been arrested a couple times for the work that you've done. How was that experience? How was it to have to undergo the kind of consequences of what you say?
Well, it's part of the job, I suppose. It's part of the way, it's part of the reality. I mean, first of all, let's clarify. When an Israeli gets arrested, it's not like a Palestinian getting arrested. I mean, right there and then, we could be, well, we were in the exact same place, doing the exact same thing. A Palestinian gets thrown in a jeep, gets beat up, gets handcuffed and blindfolded, and nobody knows when he or she are coming back.
Exactly.
We get handcuffed sometimes. We're put in a jeep. We're offered water and coffee, and then we're sent to a police station where there's already a phone call from our lawyers already waiting.
Right, especially if you're a general's son, right?
Well, regardless. I mean, my father has not been a general for a long time. But regardless, if you're an Israeli, you have rights. And I talk about this in the book. In one particular case, I was at the police station in the settlement of Kiryat Arba in Hebron, because the army arrested me, and they gave me the police, but they didn't bring the paperwork with the charges or whatever, some technicality.
Right.
And the police chief at the station said to the soldiers, look, he's not some Arab I can just throw in a cell and throw away the keys. An Israeli's got rights. I got to process him properly. And, most of the times by the end of the day, we go home, and then eventually maybe we might have to go in front of a judge, but most times we don't. It's not pleasant by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a small price to pay when you're privileged, and you know that you're privileged at the expense of somebody else, and you make a decision. You either stand with Palestinian brothers and sisters and resist, or you don't. There's no middle ground here. There's no room for solidarity. I don't believe in solidarity. You wear a T-shirt that says Free Palestine. It doesn't help any Palestinian. I mean, you know what I mean? We're past that.
Exactly.
So if you participate in the struggle, you're going to pay a price. Again, granted, the price that we pay as privileged Israelis is nowhere near, not even remotely near what Palestinians are paying.
Absolutely. And I want to make one quick reference to, you mentioned a turning point and how you kind of really start to think about all these things that kind of led to your journey of activism. You said in your speech that your niece was actually killed in a suicide bombing, where I believe you said 2 young Palestinian men killed themselves and a number of other people died. Your niece, who was very young, by the way, was a part of them. And the way you explained the way that your sister reacted in that situation, can you explain a little bit of that and why you considered that somewhat of a turning point in your journey?
Yeah, well, it was the beginning of my journey, really. And it wasn't 2. Initially, people thought it was 2. Actually, 3 young Palestinians blew themselves up. People talk about it like, oh, yeah, there was suicide bombing. Whoa, what? What is going on here? What in the world would bring 3 young, healthy men to blow themselves up and take the lives of other people? What's going on here? And the strength and the greatness of my sister's comments was that she saw that immediately. There was the grief of seeing her daughter in the morgue. Didn't turn any blinders on. She looked really clearly at what was going on, and she said immediately, first of all, don't talk to me about revenge and retaliation, because no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. And number 2, what do we expect when we treat people like this? That there's not going to be retaliation, that someone's not going to come out and want to exact revenge, that we're not going to lose innocent people. And she pointed a finger straight at the Israeli government, and Netanyahu was prime minister at the time, and he was a close friend of hers when they were young, so they knew each other well. And so she pointed a finger right away and said, the Israeli government killed my daughter, without any question. So to me, that was the start of my journey. I came back to the U.S. after that, and you can't just go back to work the next day. I mean, this is the kind of thing that shakes you to the core. And so then I began engaging and becoming, looking for ways to engage and be active.
I think it's really important you say that, because death on either side is very tragic. But as you say yourself, when we try to say we want to have a balanced story, hear both sides, or like you say, solidarity, it's like saying the playing field is equal, and now we're saying let's start having a conversation as equals. But when one side has been treated as nothing close to even an equal, it's really hard to say you can have a balanced outlook when there is no balanced playing field to begin with. The 2-state solution is one of those things, anytime people talk about peace talks or any kind of solution to this, decades long issue, is, the 2-state solution is the way to go. And you've spoken many times about how that is not viable and it's not the right solution. Why would you say so? And what would you propose is the best way to go about this moving forward for the Palestinians specifically?
Well, I think if anybody thinks a two-state solution is a good idea, let them explain themselves. How is it a good idea? I don't understand how the two-state solution is a good idea. According to the two-state solution, which was a Zionist construct, that my father was part of the group of Zionists that invented it, if you will, after 1967, with the idea that Palestinians would get the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as a state, and Israel would maintain the large portion of Palestine that was taken in 1948.
Right.
How is that a good solution? Who's it good for? Why not the other way around?
Exactly.
You know what I mean? If you're going to have a two-state solution, who gets what? I mean, why is it so clear to everybody that Palestinians should now? That's to begin with. I mean, it's inherently, fundamentally flawed. The basic idea that Palestinians should somehow agree to something like this is fundamentally flawed. Today, all these years later, I mean, Israel made no secret of the fact that they did everything they possibly could so that would never be a possibility.
Exactly.
And the argument initially by people like my father was, well, if we don't compromise on the West Bank, then we're going to end up with a binational state, and then it's going to be either apartheid or a democratic country, which won't be a Jewish state. So today we're at that place. Today we have one state over all of Palestine. There's one state. It's the apartheid state of Israel.
Exactly.
But if we oppose apartheid, if we believe in human rights, if we believe in freedom, if we believe that Palestine should be free, then we need to struggle with our Palestinian brothers and sisters to free Palestine, bring down Zionism like apartheid was brought down in South Africa, establish a free democratic Palestine, and make sure that we have mechanisms in place so that the right of return can begin immediately, not as a bumper sticker slogan, but can materialize. And, mechanisms have to be put in place immediately to see that the refugees are able to return and be compensated and be paid reparations. But I mean, the whole idea of a two-state solution is ridiculous. It's flawed.
I mean, it is really ridiculous, and I think a lot of people have started to realize that as well, because like you said, the one thing that remains here is you can't expect a system that has come into place for a very specific reason, and we're talking about Zionism here. You can't expect the system to suddenly start performing differently than it was designed to. But do you think that's realistic to expect? Do you think something like that will materialize in the near or even far future? What we're seeing now is, Zionism itself is backed fully by the West. As you know, with people getting into politics, it's like being a Zionist and a Zionist supporter is something that you have to check off the list before you get into any position of power. How do you see that materializing realistically?
It's up to us. I mean, it's not going to happen on its own. If we act, if we get our act together, then it's realistic. If we don't, it's not. It's not going to be a miracle. In Washington, D.C., in Washington, D.C., there's not a single Palestinian flag anywhere. And then never mind a representation, never mind an office that represents Palestinian interests, or that pushes forward the Palestinian, there's nothing. If we permit that to go on, if we permit our elected officials to continue to support Israel, then of course nothing's going to change. It's like people say, well, do you think BDS is a good idea? What do you mean is it a big good idea? It is a fundamental aspect of the struggle to free Palestine. Now people say, yeah, but if I boycott Israeli avocado and hummus, is that going to make a difference? No. We're talking about boycotting Israel. We're putting pressure on the Olympic Committee that Israel is not permitted to participate in the Olympics and in FIFA and in academic arenas and in cultural arenas, and demand that Israeli diplomats be kicked out. And on. That's what boycott is. We need to demand that there's sanctions, severe sanctions against the state of Israel. That's what BDS is about. Yeah, the avocados and the hummus are important, but it's about these other bigger things that are going to make the difference. Exactly. Now, are we going to act, or are we going to sit around and wait for it to happen by somebody else? That will determine. That is going to determine whether or not it's going to happen sooner or later. It's really all up to us. And right now, I don't have to tell you this. I mean, the Zionists are 100 years ahead of us.
Right. They are. And I think a part of it is also, like you said, a lot of people are used to activism that's limited to, the social media sphere of like posting things and then being like, all right, cool, I'm off the hook. I've done my part. So I think I know people that want to get awards for the fact that they're sitting on Facebook and hitting like whenever they see something Palestinian. And also the other thing is, even the few little organizations that exist here and there, so if something happens, there's a protest.
too late. The protest should happen before something happens. We know there's going to be another attack on Gaza. We know that Palestinian children are going to be murdered in Gaza again. Why are we? What are we doing staying at home?
We can't entirely even put a lot of people like to say, it's, the Muslims are doing everything, it's the rest of us. Muslim communities really have a long way to support the Palestinians as well, because one thing we also see with Muslim communities is a lot of them will purposely avoid having that conversation because of politics. They will avoid, they might even invite, Zionist members, people who have openly endorsed Zionism, people who are very clear with their, who they're endorsing in their allegiance, and they'll still have them come to the community. And it's like, what message are we sending to our people when we do that, right?
Well, the truth is, Muslim communities used to, but if you see my other book, Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation, that's why Muslims today are afraid to talk about Palestine. Right. The Holy Land Foundation was closed down. 5 good men were sent to federal prison on terrorism charges. They were the finest men you will ever meet. Not only were they not, wouldn't dream of supporting terrorism, they had nothing to do with this, but still they were targeted, and they paid a heavy price. So people are afraid of that. The other part of the Muslim equation are the Muslim countries. Israel is heavily in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Pakistan, lobbying, and there are forces in all of these countries saying, why do we normalize? Why do we need to be, it's good for us to work with Israel. Why shouldn't we work? And they don't know. So I was involved in a campaign in Indonesia. They asked me to, because an Israeli team was going to play there. And, and I was in Malaysia several times. And even people in Pakistan are saying, well, why not normalize with Israel, And the pressure is great. Biden nominated a full ambassador to go and convince these countries to normalize relations with Israel.
It's working, because a lot of them do have that relation.
Yeah. And in Africa too, the same thing in Africa. African countries were big supporters of Palestine. Now there's, the ones that are destroyed, not just in Africa, but Libya is destroyed, and Iraq is destroyed, and Yemen is destroyed, and Syria. All these countries that did support. But Israel has got over 40 diplomatic missions in Africa. There's no Palestinian voice anywhere countering this, and that's why we're in the state that we are. So what can people do? Talk about it, push this around. Don't be afraid to challenge the elected officials.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And I do think you definitely, as a person, as an activist, as an author, have, I would say, very much contributed to this conversation and, promoting, Palestinian rights and speaking about the injustices that are happening. So thank you for that as well. And thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really benefited from your words and your insight.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.